Hey, Greg, coming in. I've got this thing around my ear. I said to him, I'm a sun sign Pisces square Neptune. You know, that's why I can't get with this computer stuff. He said, I am too. He just channels it into this, you know? And thank you very much for that. Because he just did this last night for me, and it's great. This morning, yeah. So here, at the bottom level, we have Pisces, Neptune, 12th house. And on an ultimate level, archetypally, we have the ground of being, the great sea, the underlying everything and nothing of consciousness. That's the ultimate archetype. And arising from that in Pluto, Scorpio, 8th house, is the soul, a particularized manifestation of this everything, with its own desires to become ever more itself, contrasting with this desire to return to this ocean from whence it came. This is the Pluto, Scorpio, 8th house level. And here at the very tip, we start to focus an ego, a particularized consciousness. Mark, Greg, the part of us that knows our name, that is particularized. When he was sharing these archetypes with us in our school in London, Jeffrey used this metaphor of the wave to show the different types of separating desire and desire for return within the Pluto archetype. And I've thought about this metaphor a lot. And I think this metaphor holds a great teaching about life on a personal level, and it also holds, in a way, the entire teaching of evolutionary astrology. Because in the particular point of the wave, the soul generates us, particularized egos, this little finite consciousness I am, with all my screw-ups and hang-ups. And if we look to the south node of the moon, we begin to see the potential for the history of those egos. But I'm going to come back to that. That's the point I want to get to today. I would like to take us on a journey where we come to the central method of the evolutionary axis in evolutionary astrology, being able to look through Pluto and the nodes to find the deepest aspects of ourselves. But first I'd like to talk on a little bit of a personal level, just to try and ground what these things might mean and the way they might work. Because how many of us, as Jeffrey asked that shocked, suited room of astrologers, how many of us know our own souls right now? How many of us know it totally? Frequently in life, the soul operates on a primarily unconscious level, at least initially. I remember when I was a small child, when I was about 9 or 10 years old, I was in Sunday school. Like a kind of Bible class, but the British version. And I previously enjoyed quite a few of them because there were all these stories and parables, and it was quite nice. But one day this vicar, this old guy, starts telling us, 10-year-old children, this hell situation, and how many of us are heading that way. Now, I'm a Pluto Virgo, 29 degrees Virgo, retrograde in the 9th house. My moon, very widely trine that Pluto, is in Capricorn in the 1st house. And I felt angry, I felt motivated, and I stood up, and I risked all the comeback, and I said, well, how come if this God's so loving, we're all going there, you know? And that was the end of Sunday school for me. Yeah? That was it. Even my mum could tell from the vicar's look on the face when she came to pick me up that, okay, I wasn't going back, and that's okay. But I had experienced, and I felt awful. I mean, I left, and my mum was a bit like, what's gone on? the guilt inside me, the having to struggle with authority in that way, but something unconscious had come through from this other place where I knew differently. I couldn't have consciously analyzed my Pluto in Virgo in the 9th house at that time. I didn't truly understand where that was coming from, but I knew if this Christ figure or this God figure were real, it didn't work like that. I'd like to just extend this personal story a little bit more. This Moon in Capricorn deal, it's not the easiest deal to be born with. There's this tendency to internalize guilt and shame. I remember as a teenager, by this point I was wearing black all the time in mourning for my life. I was smoking a bit of pot, skipping school, still doing well at school, finding nothing inherent in that. And I remember walking through my village to meet a girl that had written to me. I'd met her on a school trip. Because when you're a swotty, geeky kid who plays chess and Dungeons and Dragons and dresses in black, you don't meet many girls in your school. Yeah? So I had to kind of go to other schools. So I'd met this girl, and she'd been writing these lovely letters to me and was really opening up to me. And I was walking through my village, and I felt awful. I mean, every step I took, I just got deeper into the sickness, deeper into the despair. And by the time I met this girl who'd come away on the train, I chatted to her, rigid as this, walked around for half an hour, and then got her back on the train and sent her home. Because I felt so sick, I couldn't even walk her back to my house. I couldn't let her share, because I felt so horrible about it. But then, the soul reflection here is Pluto in Virgo, 9th. I felt horrible afterwards for having treated another person like this. For weeks afterwards, I felt terrible, more terrible about the sickness I felt in the place where I lived, that I just, generated this connection with someone and then just let them go. And Pluto 9th Virgo, I vowed never to do it again. I mean, I'm not sure I've done that perfectly. Pluto in Virgo, I wouldn't think I've done that perfectly, but the intent was there. So soul operates unconsciously. Soul is something we reflect on after we've personally experienced things, particularly when we're young, or it comes through in dreams or in strong intuitions. But sometimes in our lives, we experience almost like a direct inflow. That time happened for me when I was 24 in Chalice Well in Glastonbury, a holy water center. And I was meditating with a group of people who were doing landscape meditation. And different people were walking off to different points in the environment to create a shared context. And I was just stood above this trickling stream, and suddenly all that Capricornian negativity and shame just drained straight out of me into the earth. It just all pulled away. And I felt very, very light. And this other quality came in to replace that. Like an alien quality, but that felt more like myself than I'd ever felt. Like another person literally was coming in, but one that felt more like me than I had previously. And there was a man on this course, a man who had lost his entire family in the Holocaust. And he was in his 70s, Jewish man. And he'd taken offense at some stuff I'd been joking around with earlier in the day about youth and age, and I'm, at 24 I think I thought I was old, and I was making some nonsense about it, and he felt offended. And he came up to me when I was in that experience, and I was talking to him in that experience, and I was saying, I'm very sorry, I really didn't mean that by it. And I was saying all these right things on a personality level. But what I felt was really going on was this other space had opened up in my heart. And although I was speaking to him, although I was saying words that were important, what was going on was in this other space in my heart, almost like a little flower had opened up, and I was giving him a petal from that flower. And that's what I was truly experiencing and feeling, even though I was this being saying these words to him. And he melted. And we walked along in silence together, and we ate in silence together. Sometimes this otherness comes in, and for moments we know something of ourselves. This is the Pluto level of consciousness sometimes, this larger river of life. And a number of practical questions have been raised with regard to evolutionary astrology over the course of this conference. You know, what's the difference between Pluto and the polarity point and the nodes? Questions like this. And this is the fundamental area. The distinction is in this level. As I'm often teaching my students, I hold a blue pen for the Pluto level and a red pen for the personality, and we show the different streams. Because this is the river of life, Pluto. This is the birth of a soul like a tributary up in a mountain stream. And the river, the journey of that soul to the great sea at the end. This is the level of Pluto, and the polarity point is the way down the river. In the slice of that chart through that river, the polarity point is the way further down that river. And the nodes are a much more personal, conscious phenomena, potentially. This node is like a boat we can paddle down that river with. The north node's like the best paddle we could possibly develop. Beavering away down that long river. And I think it's understanding that fundamental distinction that opens up the potential through Pluto and the nodes to understand the evolutionary axis. The soul, in its desire to separate and individualize and its desire to return, will develop long-term plans for us. You may have Pluto in the 7th, and I have Pluto in the 9th. We may have been following those winds in the river for many, many lifetimes. We may have manifested many particular entities, many moons, to try and develop those longer-term goals. The history of those many moons is held in the south node of the moon. The moon is this point at the tip of the wave. Jeffrey in Pluto 1 talks about the projector, the film projector. Here, Neptune Pisces would be the white light. Pluto would be the film in the projector. And Cancer, the moon, would be the lens that allows that film to be seen. Because without this particularization, I will not be able to distinguish inside myself all these different images. They will just become a blur. So when we identify the bottom line in a chart at Pluto, we're looking to access the soul's bottom line. Its longer-term passage down that river. When we turn to the moon and the south nodes of the moon, we're looking at the particular types of prior life egos that have facilitated or not facilitated that larger Pluto purpose. Separating desire. The soul has natural desires to want to express itself, to wish to grow. A number of people have talked wonderfully about this paradox. We can't pretend we've eliminated our separating desires. We may know that the desire to return is the most powerful one underlying all these desires ultimately. But you can't pretend that you've dealt with your separating desires. There's a real paradox here. If Pluto, as this wave, only indulges in separating desires, the length of the ocean is practically infinite. There's no exhausting the limits. The only limit is imagination and the number of separating desires you can have. The addict has no limit on the number of times they shoot up, they look at porn, whatever. There's no end. In fact, the more you get into it, the more you need. This is just the wave traveling aimlessly down the ocean. There's no limit to that desire nature on a horizontal axis. If we only travel, if we only hunt for more bodies, for more warm flesh, for more drugs, there's not a limit to that. The point being that in the vertical axis of consciousness, that desire can change, can alter. I'm going to tell one more personal story, just to illustrate this relationship between Scorpio and Pisces. Actually, before I do that, let me do one more general example here of what I'm talking about with these signatures. I'm going to take, on this left-hand side, if you like, the Christian example, and on the right-hand side, the Buddhist example. In Christianity, in a true relationship with Christianity, we have an idea of heaven that is the Godhead, or the Goddess head, the Godhead, the almighty everything, the almighty nothing. In Kabbalah, they call something tzimtzum, which is the mysterious withdrawal God does. He steps back and creates this emptiness so everything can be born out of it. This is, if you like, heaven. This is the everything. On the Pluto level, if you like, this is coming from the everything into manifestation. I'm going to go backwards, as it were, and then see how we trace from a chart the other direction. From the everything emerges a soul force, Christ, a particular entity, but one born truly from the waters. Like a vast force. Imagine being there. Imagine listening to him talk and really seeing what that soul force looked like, feeling what it felt like. This quality manifesting inside him. And then on the particular level, you have Jesus, Jeshua. You have a man. You have the particular entity. In Buddhist terms, here you have Dharmakaya, the ground of all being, that everything, underpinning everything, every act, every moment in consciousness, is just an underlying ground. From our point of view, some Buddhists call this emptiness, but you could just as much easily call it fullness. It's empty and full at the same time. It underpins everything. And from that Dharmakaya rises Sambhogakaya, what they call the illusory body. And in this form we find the deity again. So to parallel Christ, if we took the Buddha of compassion, a particular deity arises, a particular form from the underlying ground of everything. And then in Buddhism, they call it Nirmanakaya, the tip of the wave, the manifestation body, the particular material form the Buddha took. That's the process working from the sea upwards. What we're so often doing in our lives is working the other way around. Trying to connect from our particularity to the deeper causes of why we're here. I see this Neptune level, just on a personal level, as a kind of white love, like an ocean of white love. I remember once on a particularly powerful experience when I was a young man. I experienced myself being reborn in that river of white love, and I was just sobbing. Moon Capricorn. The sheer grief of the joy of experiencing what that feels like, as compared to what my life previously had felt like. This is the source. This is this deeper form, if you like. I don't understand every mystery in creation, and I don't pretend to. But from the point of view of evolutionary astrology, this is a particular form of the everything that chooses to manifest this. And it chooses to do this for a reason. And that's the potential that evolutionary astrology has over other forms of astrology. Has the potential to directly access some of those reasons. The personal story, to understand this relationship here. When I was meditating at that well in Glastonbury, I had a teacher there. And in a dream, quite a few years later, the dream the night before I had an empowerment with a Tibetan Lama. This teacher appeared to me in a dream, and the group of us that were to undergo the initiation were all handed crystals by this old teacher of mine. And we sat there with our crystals, very proud and happy, and we were meditating together. This is in the dream. Then in the dream, I started to fall asleep. So I'm asleep, and I'm dreaming, and in the dream, I'm falling asleep. And there's this little old Tibetan man shaking my shoulder. I'm like, oh, sorry, we're supposed to be meditating on compassion or something. I felt quite apologetic. I said, I'm sorry, I fell asleep. I was falling asleep. And he said, it's all right, that happens sometimes. And I said, proud as a peacock, but look, I have this crystal. And he just took it out of my hand and threw it into the sand where it disappeared. He just threw it away in front of me. I couldn't believe it. I was absolutely staggered. I was flabbergasted. And I said to him, incredibly British comment to say, really. I said, we don't do things like that where I come from. And get this, he turned right to me, stared right in my eyes, and he said, we do things like that where I come from. And he was taking some symbolic gift, some representation of this identity, and he was throwing it right back in the sand, right back into the constituent particles that had made this crystal, right back into the underlying ground of being. And that just freaked me right out. This is the two-way relationship here. Pluto on one level rises from that ocean, on another level, it's thrown back in. Are there any questions at this stage of the talk? Are there any questions on this model that I've presented? Fine. So what I'm going to do is just talk about this a little bit more as a method now before we approach a chart. I spoke in my last talk about the archetype of Cancer as the emotional body, the particular form the emotional body has taken in an individual's lifetime. Here I'm going to talk about how we can trace the origins of the prior life emotional bodies through the South Node. So in looking first at Pluto, we're identifying or looking to identify the underlying soul intention based on unconscious, deep-seated unconscious security patterns formed within that soul. Let's imagine, in that great river of life, 9th house Pluto, you've wanted to learn about things. You've wanted to learn about the beauty of the night sky. You've wanted to learn the great teachings of the world. You develop, over time, attachment to that process. The security it gives you, the vision that it brings to you. This is the process, this is the unconscious security we're analyzing when we look at a Pluto placement in a chart. We're looking to find those underlying soul themes. And then in coming back to the South Node, we're looking to find the prior life ego forms and their nature that tried to make that theme happen. To give it purpose, to give it response. And then when we look to the ruler of the South Node, we're looking at the different ways we may have facilitated that process in the past. Before this gets to sound too abstract, I'm going to move to a chart example in a moment. It becomes a crucial distinction. If you understand this as the soul intention or soul issue involved in a chart, then Pluto becomes the bottom line for the whole chart, and you can refer everything in the chart back through Pluto. Because everything occurs because of that. Okay, if we can move to the chart example. So here we have a 12th house Pluto retrograde in Leo. Pluto in Leo is a generational signature. We know that this person is coming into this life with a conscious development or creative plan. This person has an inner understanding of the creative blueprint they wish to manifest in their life on some level. It's not just a purely instinctual one. If this was Pluto in Aries or in the first house, this would be an instinctual process. But no, it's in Leo. There's the same sense of special destiny you would get with a Pluto Aries or Pluto first. But here the creativity has consciously been activated, consciously understood on some level. But there's also this tremendous need for positive feedback. To develop that special destiny, to take the risk, of articulating that special purpose requires this constant positive feedback and support. There is this potential for almost like a bottomless pit of need when it comes to that feedback. We know that Pluto in the 12th house, coming through the Pisces archetype that Stephen talked about earlier, we're asked to come to the edge of a cliff. Everything we've ever known is before us, behind us, back there. Everything we've been through. And this future lies out, covered by the clouds. And can we take the step or can't we? And because this is a soul level, we're looking in this chart at this time, we know that dynamic, this sense of my creative purpose, am I going to get the feedback that I need? Everything that I've known has brought me to this cliff edge. Can I surrender and break through? May have been going on time and time again. When we look to the kind of people that have been trying to live this purpose in its many and various forms, we come to the South Node in Virgo, in the first. Virgo, the antithesis of Leo, if you like. The next step. When we come to the South Node ruler, we're looking at the process of how this was facilitated. I looked at those signatures. Stephen was talking to us about how to connect with a client. This lady had come to me. She was a professional therapist, had been for a long time. And she wanted to know about evolutionary astrological dynamics. That was her specific intention. I already had this certain level of rapport, if you like. And I looked at these signatures, this 12th house Pluto, knowing we've lived in this age of Pisces for so long, looking to the South Node in Virgo, the sub-age of Pisces. The age of Pisces began with Christ. And halfway through every age, a sub-age kicks in. This was the age of Virgo. The building of the cathedrals, the formation of Christianity. We look at this person needing to develop their creativity, needing to do so in a way that encourages that spiritual precipice experience. I looked at that South Node Virgo, and I looked at that Mercury retrograde in the 9th, ruling it. This person was going, I've had years of therapy, I work as a therapist. I'd like to know about my past lives. And I said to me, it seems to me, looking at this chart, I could imagine you, I said, as a scribe in a monastery, taking great care, Taurus, over presenting the books that you were copying and writing in. And this lady stopped. Could someone just get me a glass of water? Thanks very much.
I'm going to grab your cat.
Cheers. This lady turned to me, and I genuinely think this was a first for her. This was the first time she'd remembered this. Thank you very much. Thank you. As a small child, 7 or 8 in primary school, in little school in England, she remembered when she was learning her letters for the alphabet. In her little journal she'd been given to learn the alphabet letters. She spent the whole first period of time drawing this massive first letter and colouring it in with all her different pens. And then she drew squiggles through the rest of the book. And she remembered that with me. Rapport can take place on many levels. And if you connect with a person and allow them to remember something like that, and to potentially see the context, that it validates the kind of experience they may have had in the past, you're in a connection with that person in a new way. Why would a child do that if it hadn't been some kind of echo or past experience? But let's look at these signatures more closely. If this person wanted to develop their creativity, and through a South Node in Virgo there was an analytical process to that, and a Mercury in the 9th house facilitating it, this person is going to have desired an education in that past. They're going to want to know and understood and analyze the different processes that have taken place within inside them. A number of very, very sincere souls throughout the last few thousand years of history have taken their journey, their soul's journey to monasteries in order to learn. If for simple practical reasons, they were the only source of books half the time. But with this Saturn retrograde on the South Node and the South Node in Virgo, we know that there have been internalized messages through this process. What kind of books would she have been scribing? What kind of messages would have been inside those books? And to what extent has she internalized those messages? And we get the picture of someone who very sincerely wanted to come and learn, and begins to do that and begins to scribe, and then begins to take on the message of what she herself is writing. And that message begins to say things to her like, it's not cool to have feelings. It's not cool to be a woman in a body. It's not cool to feel sexual feelings. And she begins to internalize profound messages. When we begin to talk like this lady and I, she shares with me that she's never been able to touch herself and feel comfortable. Never. The internalized shame is so great. And the guilt. And here we have a complex signature of guilt in that past. Guilt's a two-way street, isn't it? Sometimes we do things wrong. Sometimes we're just beleaguered by messages over time, a teaching like it's not okay to have feelings, it's not okay to be sexual. If you experience that for long enough, you internalize it, you feel shame. Across this nodal axis, we can identify a skip step. Venus and Gemini in the 10th. A 10th house archetype in the skip step, echoing the Saturn on the South Node. Again, the dynamic of injected versus authentic guilt starts to take place. And we could almost imagine, and I talked with this lady like this, that in this desire to develop her creativity in these contexts, in the desire to learn, she herself may have begun to take on positions of power. If we assume that this story, this feeling, this congruence we've created through the scribe has taken place, she may have found herself in those situations, rising to positions of eminence in some way, and therefore beginning to teach back to others that come the very messages that have so messed around with her insides, which have created the inner feeling of persecution, the inner lie. I think that's the tragedy in a way with the Virgo signature in some ways, that through the initial distortion, it becomes so internalized that we actually act it out and present it to others as if it was our truth. Now, this lady was making up a lot of ground in her life. The skip step on a very mundane and literal level was emanating. She was the head of a whole counseling phone organization, so that people left alone and bereaved could ring in. She managed all the lines. She supervised all the people counseling. She was developing her own authority in that world. But in her own world, she couldn't be with another person, particularly an intimate, without, when they had left, falling apart. After making this connection about her childhood experience writing in this book, this lady was able to cry with me about 10 minutes after I'd met her. She was just sobbing. And she said every time she was with a man that she felt connection, or even a close friend, but usually the boyfriends that she'd really tried to have in her life, and they left, she would just break down and cry. Grief. Through the 10th house archetype. Grief at the shame, grief at the loss of potential. In remembering this and sharing this together, she was able to talk about other experiences in that school. Pluto Leo. She talked about the time she fought the head nun when she asked to paint pictures, when she asked for some art in her schooling, and she was told no, and she was made to stand outside the door holding books for hours at a time. And she didn't give in. She wouldn't give in. And she held those books for so long, she was finally allowed to do art. This was the quality that had been the backbone of her entire life, standing there holding those books, scribbling in them, living under the weight of them. Thanks, dude. Thanks a lot.
It's a water lecture.
Yes. Any questions about this chart or what I've raised so far? Yes.
Is there significance to the Saturn opposing Jupiter?
Absolutely. I mean, we see there this desire in the Jupiter placement, essentially, to form a new cycle of the way she thinks and believes about relationships and her sexuality. This is essentially what we began to go on to talk about, how that might happen, because it was causing so much pain and distress in her life. So, having talked so kind of really about what happened to her, we were able to talk about, very gently, long, soft baths, the self-connection being developed before that intimate experience could be shared.
Talk to us about the Mercury conjunct the Sun, which is the dispositor of Pluto.
Yes.
And the ascendant in the ninth, which I understand her connection to the monastery or
Yes.
the houses of learning. But in Taurus, for me, it takes on a little bit of a different ring than a scribe.
This, for me, the initial connection with the scribe was the sheer beauty put into the letters and the art of it. But yes, it does take on much more meaning. This is the internal resources of the self through the Taurus archetype. With the Sun, Mercury, Mars together like that, we see the message around sexuality taken in by the teachings, sexuality. And through all this distorted judgment from the past, the fact in particular that masturbation or self-touch was viewed in a belief system as so wrong. With the Mercury retrograde by the Sun here would be the current life purpose, the energy and purpose in the current life, the central energy. With the Mercury retrograde right by it, we see the desire to uncover these beliefs. To go back and remember them, manically scribbling as a child. And to see the impact on the internal resources of the self. It's an echo of the second house cusp, highlighted through the Saturn conjunction. The internal resources of the self have taken on so many messages. She's internalized so much. And she's having problems just being with another, even though she does all this work in the world. And the desire here is to develop internal self-sufficiency and security through a different belief system, through one that corresponds with natural laws, that gives permission to emotions and sexuality. We all have those feelings, or most of us. And this lady certainly did. Once she was able, through the tears, to talk about that, her desire to own those feelings was really strong. And even though I was very gentle and delicate with her, she was getting quite excited at one point. The idea of a way of thinking that included spirituality, that included even a heart connection to Christ, that was still okay to take long sensuous baths, touch yourself gently with oils afterwards. This really worked for her. This was something she was kind of planning to go and try when she'd left the session. Are there any other questions? Oh.
Could you talk about that polarity point in Aquarius you said?
Absolutely. Here the polarity point is echoing through an archetypal resonance, the South Node in Virgo, and the Virgo placement on the second house cusp. With an Aquarian polarity point, the soul is seeking an increased objectivity and detachment from the issues and feelings of the past. And here we see, I guess, this strong crisis theme in this chart emphasized. Virgo crisis. Crisis about the instinctual body in the past, and all the messages and suppressive regimes, the holding the books in this life, physically demanding, persecutory, the way that's been internalized. And here we see the crisis, the need to develop a step-by-step method of objectifying all that she's felt, the reasons that brought her there in the first place, the desire for her to express her creativity and to come to this edge of where she felt herself inside to be spiritually. And to understand that in the past, those desires, sincere as they might have been, had brought her to this very limited, destructive place. And I see Virgo here emphasized in a polarity point. For this lady, it's not the one bath when she went home that night isn't going to sort it all out. It's going to have to be a step-by-step process of taking those baths and remembering why she needed to take them, even when she gets the attack again of the Virgo distress. I've had 3 baths on the run this week, 3 nights on the run. I felt kind of good about it. And then the 4th night, it's like, oh, I'm horrible. And the need to stay with this process of remembering why.
What evolutionary stage is she in, Marty?
The individuated.
Would you address that? Because I see that Neptune, the ruler of a resolution node, has only one aspect, which is to the Venus.
Well, it has this yod to the node as well,
Okay, right.
which is another extension of the crisis archetype we're talking about in this chart. This chart repeats crisis and a theme on so many levels. Through the South Node, through the second house cusp and the Saturn on the South Node, through the yod from Pluto and Neptune to the North Node. And that's the forgiveness crisis. Evolutionary condition. You know, I'm going to confess something here. When I was presented this lady's chart as she walked in the room, it was a situation like that. I just went with my gut with the symbols and connected with this person. It's only later, as you asked me right now. I mean, I intuited in the individuated condition, and I'll talk about that now, because in the individuated condition, that's where we receive the most damage. Because that's the condition that has the most jarring impact upon the prevailing norms. So in the individuated condition, we're at the most prone from those consensus powers hitting back. So it's in that condition we often experience the most damage. This lady had a potential, a burgeoning potential for a sincere spiritual impulse. I would place her in the higher individuated, with a possibility for that breakthrough really coming into herself. The possibility is all held through this North Node, isn't it? I mean, it's held partly through the work she's doing. Venus in Gemini is a skip step. As a skip step, we stand on the skip step. For those who don't know about skip steps, we stand on it looking into the circle, and we resolve it through the node that we walk round to the left. It's just a simple practical trick for always being visually clear where a skip step resolves. Here with the Venus and Gemini in the 10th, we stand on Venus looking in, we walk to the left, it's coming to the North Node. In her work talking to these people, she was genuinely trying to listen to their needs. And many of their needs would have included emotional and sexual issues similar to her own, and she was having to be open and forgiving to that. Yes?
You were talking about the moon and Pluto connections before.
Yes.
How do you connect the moon there?
Well, I mean, we haven't had a chance to talk about everything that I talked about with this person. She had very difficult parental relationships. And of course, in the case of the mother, very controlling, and was passed to severe sort of religious schooling, in part to take away that pressure from the family, or the problematic interaction. And she would experience this emotional conflict again, the wide square there, with the mother superiors, the new mothers in the regime. Any more questions?
Really go out on a limb. Is there some signature of past life forced virginity in this second house Saturn Virgo retrograde?
Well, those monastic experiences would have included enforced celibacy. Although what I feel we're looking at with those signatures in this second house cusp that you identify is Venus, again, is the natural ruler of the second. In the archetypal chart, Taurus would be on the second house, and Venus is a skip step in Gemini. We're looking at a number of possible situations here. One, we're looking at a situation where as she rises to positions of power or eminence, within those situations, taking on those messages, she teaches to others messages. You can't touch each other, you can't be involved in that way. But perhaps is herself unable to stop doing that. Or experiences tremendous guilt for maybe the few desires she has had that in that area herself. And she begins to experience this inner sense of having lied to others through giving that teaching that she has internalized from what she has gone through. Another possibility with a signature like this, Venus in Gemini, Venus ruling the third house with the Neptune right on the cusp of the third house, and this heavy judgment signature around sexuality from the past is a sibling sexuality story. That's a possibility here. that maybe within a family experience, she has reached out to touch or explore the other being there with her in the family, and that she has been found out, judged or punished in some fundamental way for that. There are a number of potential stories through following that. But I feel that the enforced celibacy or virginity or whatever that you were asking me about was a self-enforcement, and came with tremendous internal guilt because maybe she had the desires but was unable to act on them, or had maybe acted on them briefly but then punished herself and punished possibly even others as a result of that. So let's, we can always come back to it if we need to, but if that's all the questions, then we'll lose that chart for the moment. It's all right for the moment. We'll just, in fact, can we switch it off? Thanks. I'm tempted, we just take another chart, we find another chart ourselves in a moment. But what I'd really like to talk about is some of the basic methodology or laws or rules of evolutionary astrology. Just briefly, just to check in that everyone's got that coming here to a conference like this. So, I'm going to talk briefly about Pluto conjunct the South Node. Here we're looking at a signature where the soul level of evolution and the prior life ego types completely combined. The unconscious security of the soul, its complexes, the places, the issues it's been dealing with, are coming right through and that are conjoined with the type of prior life egos that have been developing that purpose. So this could obviously work in two extremes, if you like, two extreme ways. This could be a tremendously powerful thing. A person coming in, having worked on a prior life ego level, with their soul's purpose coming right through. We have a signature where we are reliving the power, the gift. Or we can have the direct opposite signature, that there has been a collision, a compulsion, a resistance, the other side of Pluto. Let's remember, Pluto in any archetype totally intensifies the potential of that archetype. It goes through every hill and vale, right up, right down. So with Pluto conjunct the South Node, we have this intense relive signature where we could be reliving quite directly gifts from the soul, or we could be reliving a direct resistance to the evolutionary intention of that soul. Very paradoxical signature. And much more common than either of those two extremes is a situation where we are doing a little bit of the one thing and a little bit of the other. We're coming through with a couple of gifts, things we've developed that we really want to give and bring to the world. And we're coming through with other areas in our life where we feel completely resistant, completely compulsively stuck or trapped. It took a bit of time before I was confident enough to ask clients what Jeffrey has always counseled doing with Pluto conjunct South Node. When the client comes to you, you literally just say, are there areas of your life that you feel you're bringing something of a gift to your life that you feel really good about, and other areas of your life where you feel really consistently trapped and stuck no matter what you do? And these people often just nod straight away. There was a guy here, came up to me with his chart after my first talk. I don't know if he's in the room now. I just said that. And we have instant look of like, I know what you mean. I've known that all my life. And distinguishing what that gift is and distinguishing what that resistance or stuckness is becomes the purpose of looking at those placements. And sometimes without mitigating factors, that stuckness, and it can be very, very difficult, can last for a very long time. Because as the signature shows, the compulsion or resistance is at a very deep level, Pluto. And it has come directly through the type of prior life egos the person has had. To counteract this, to go the other way, we have a Pluto North Node situation. Pluto conjunct the North Node. Here we have a situation, the North Node being the place where we seek to consciously evolve, a situation where in recent prior lives the person has actually begun to develop the intended purpose. Not in this massive ongoing way necessarily, but recently has begun to connect with the Pluto purpose through the polarity point, and therefore extinguishes the need for a polarity point, because in continuing to hold the vein of the Pluto North Node, they are uncovering more of that purpose. By contrast, Pluto square the nodes implies a particularly profound type of skip step, where the very level of the soul's purpose is up for grabs. We're looking at a profound wrestling on an ego-soul level. The nodes, a type of prior life egos and their actions. Pluto, the soul's purpose, in direct, challenging confrontation, a struggle between ego and soul. Any questions on those placements? Yes?
Could you repeat Pluto conjunct the North Node again? You kind of breezed through that.
Absolutely. Pluto conjunct the North Node will usually imply that in recent prior lives, the person has begun to develop the polarity point of Pluto, their intended soul direction. And therefore they now bypass a polarity point in that chart and in fact just need to continue with the Pluto North Node conjunction and what it represents through sign, symbol, and aspects. Yes?
There's also a skip step, which I'm thinking of the Pluto conjunct the South Node situation.
Yes.
And there's a skip step which says you need to work on that Pluto South Node conjunction. And
Which way is the skip step needing to integrate by in that example?
to the South Node.
To the South Node, yeah.
Yes. And so my impression is the skip step itself is a resistance, and there's this
Absolutely.
potential resistance there.
Absolutely. The skip step represents one of the key issues of the block and needs to come back again. It emphasizes the relive signature even more. Yes?
Is there any difference when the North Node and Pluto is conjunct but in different signs?
Yes, there is.
Which way?
The question is it different if Pluto and North Node are conjunct in different signs or different houses, by implication too? My girlfriend has a Pluto 12th Libra conjunct a North Node 11th Libra. And all the 12th house Pluto dynamics apply to her. The cycles of meaninglessness and despair, the coming to that edge and how she's going to react to it. The nodal intention still remains to objectify relationship dynamics and interpersonal dynamics and understand them. Both are working side by side, but the Pluto-North Node conjunction still shows clearly the need that that's the direction. We're not looking across from Pluto in 12 to the 6 to find a polarity point. We are finding the journey through continuation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I was thinking more, they're in the same house but in different signs. It's Leo and Virgo. And so it's still the same house. It goes in the same direction, but with that Leo energy, I was wondering how would it bring in a different flavor?
Sure, because in a Pluto in Leo situation with a South Node in Virgo, the prior life egos following the Pluto in Leo creative purpose have already begun this process of humiliation or a different type of analysis of the will. You see, in a situation like that, you could be looking at a need to relive because that process has not taken place enough.
Could you repeat that?
The process of analyzing the will, the creative impulse, Pluto in Leo, in a more Virgo fashion. So Pluto would have to be in late Leo, yeah? And the South Node would have to be in early Virgo, if they were in the same house but conjunct.
No, the North Node
Ah, okay.
is in Leo and the Virgo Pluto.
Okay, so that's not quite an example of what we were talking about. That's just...
My question was, how would North Node and Pluto work together if they are in different signs but in the same house?
Okay. Okay. So I misheard, but I'm just going to continue my mishearing for a second because it was kind of interesting. If that's okay. And that's this example of, say, Pluto in late Leo and early South Node Virgo. I know that the question is about the North Node. Because I'm trying to talk about the example of the Pluto conjunct the North Node phenomena and the Pluto conjunct the South Node phenomena, I'll just finish this example because I know you're asking. All right, I'll answer the question. Pluto and the North Node in the same house, but not conjunct. Is that the question?
Conjunct but in different signs.
Okay, they are. So both the qualities of the signs that have been developed are part of this recent prior life development of the evolutionary intention. And both serve that development in a combined form. I was just interested myself there in this prior thing of a Pluto South Node situation with the Pluto was, say, at 28, 29 Leo, and the South Node was in early Virgo, where the Pluto placement, in the last degree of any archetype, you reach a point of almost utter transformational intensity. Any planet you have, 29 degrees of a sign, particularly Pluto, particularly a node, particularly Pluto, reaches a fundamental intensity around the transformational signature of that archetype. If Pluto was 29 degrees Leo and the South Node was in early Virgo, the necessary humiliation, or not humiliation, restructuring of the will on another level from the top of the pyramid down to the bottom has potentially begun and not been complete. Yes?
The question on a South Node conjunction, would there necessarily be a difference between the balsamic conjunction and the new phase in these two types of South Node manifestations you were talking about? One of bringing forth a gift versus a resistance? Balsamic, probably you're bringing forth a gift because you worked on that for a long time.
Both of those could imply gift, or... because both the gift and the restriction are a relief signature. It's not identifiable purely on a chart level. There has to be the observation-correlation dynamic of actually talking to the person whose chart you're looking at. And usually, I've been amazed. I was very shy initially asking those questions. And I've been amazed by how clear people have been back. A gentleman I worked with from the States recently who had Pluto South Node conjunct in Virgo. Straight away when I asked about the gifts, as a child he was brought out in an evangelical church on stage, saying things, speaking in tongues. He now works in hospitals in America, bringing really useful cancer drugs around. You ask him about intimacy, he can't go near anyone. And in fact, he chooses to have an older female companion as a de facto mother figure, even though he himself is a gay man who can't bear to express his sexuality.
Conjunct South Node retrograde, does that mean you're like stuck in repeating?
Now, Kim's been teaching us very, very usefully about the retrograde phenomena. But when it comes to Pluto retrograde, there's a slightly different application in that Pluto retrograde can apply to taking an anti-consensual stance, breaking with the consensus pattern. The nodes are always retrograde. Their entire motion is retrograde. So we needn't panic about our retrograde nodes. We've all got them. Yes?
Do you see, and you were talking about Pluto or any planet being in the last like 29 degrees because Pluto's a sort of generational type of influence. Do you actually see that ever backed up in kind of different historical sort of people, or does it manifest more just on a personal level in the individual?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Does this last degree situation with... Yeah, go on.
Transformation that you're describing often taking place in people who are born in
Well,
really
yes,
late.
because, I mean, for example, in my case, lots of my friends and myself have Pluto, well, certainly me and my sister have Pluto in the last degree of Virgo. I see it in our lives, yes. The Virgo dynamic is emphasized to the absolute nth degree, and it was emphasized through our family upbringing. And our potential is emphasized in the same way for radical forgiveness of that. But it's a constant cyclic process, that. But I guess we felt it in our lives. That's the way I relate to it. I haven't studied historical figures, no, for exactly when they have Pluto in the last degree of a sign, but it seems to me on a very personal level it works very intensely. Yes?
Kind of two questions. With Pluto square the nodes,
Yeah.
how do you feel and how does EA feel that resolution happens? Is there any kind of trick to that? And also when Pluto is before, like on the cusp, going into a new house,
Yes.
how is that interpreted and what sort of orb does EA tend to use on that?
Okay, and the orb question is a generally good question that I wanted to talk about today. I'll come back to that. So the question, I hope everyone heard that, is about how a Pluto skip step, a Pluto square the node situation resolves. Now, normally in skip steps, the skip step resolves to the node that it last hit. And we find that out quite practically by just standing on the planet, looking into the chart and moving to the left. But it's something I was curious, and I actually wanted to ask Jeffrey about the other day with questions, but I was too shy to. I thought maybe I should know that, you know. With Pluto square the nodes, is there a difference in that skip step process? I mean, we normally just take the missing dynamic and apply it back to the node that it last hit, and that's where it needs to go back in. Does Pluto work in that same way too, Jeff? Or are there any special? Pluto applies like a normal skip step, doesn't it? Sure. Yeah, so it just does the same thing, but it's a very, very intense version. When it comes to Pluto going into cusps, or Pluto moving by transit, in EA we tend to use quite big orbs because planets are often very sensitive to Pluto before it hits. You can be looking at an orb of up to 5 degrees before it hits a major planet, you can begin to feel it. And you're still dealing sometimes with some of the resonance 5 degrees after.
For a house cusp, if the natal chart has Pluto at the end of the 8th, almost in the 9th,
Yeah.
how is that interpreted? And
It's still in the 8th house, in Porphyry. Pluto orbs generally, when I'm looking at an evolutionary axis in a chart, and when I say evolutionary axis, I mean Pluto placement, polarity point, south node ruler, north node ruler, skipped steps. You can use wide orbs. These are the big brush strokes of the soul evolving through time. You can use orbs 10, 12 degrees. A skip step, you know? You have your nodes 10 Leo Aquarius and a planet's 21 Taurus. I'm still looking at it as a skip step. So, you know, obviously with smaller aspects like quintiles and stuff, you know, you really want to be tight. Yes?
Small question, since you brought up 29-degree intensity, and we know that the nodal axis always works in reverse.
Yeah.
Is 0 degrees of that, of the nodal axis, particularly intense as well?
Interesting question. I've never thought of that, I guess.
Because it's the end of that sign.
Yeah.
There's
It's because it's moving the other way. I'd have to think about that, to be honest. It'd be interesting to see. I mean, if you have charts of people you know in your life with that situation, to see if it sort of works like that. Or you yourself, yeah, to see if it works like that. To be absolutely honest with you, I'd never even thought of that question. the question was, say we have Pluto in the last degree of an archetype that's intense, very transformational. Well, the nodes move retrograde, they move backwards. So I was being asked, would it be especially intense at, say, 1 degrees to 0 degrees in where the nodes were moving? Because they move the other way around. But yes. It just came to me. I don't know. Yeah. Yes.
Could you add the moon to the mix of Pluto conjunct the south node, if the moon were also in that configuration?
If the moon were tightly conjunct, the Pluto south node conjunction, you could be looking at a number of things. One, you could be looking at a very intense personal karmic relationship with the personal mother of the client involved in the Pluto south node dynamics. But you're also looking at the implication of the emotional body, all this stuff we talked about with Cancer, involved in the relive dynamics. It's adding an extra element of information about the nature of the relive dynamics. Because, of course, these are just general structural rules, in a way, methods. Applying them time and time again through the different archetypes is going to give you the specific type of information that's involved in the relive dynamic. Yes?
Can I ask you about the skip step kind of issue again? I'm not totally sure I understand. I understand the node that's like clockwise from the planet is considered like the resolution point for that, right? But the planet is the skip step, so that has to be done, and then the resolution node has to be brought into that?
Let me take a couple of examples. Let's imagine you had a Mars skip step. Yeah, let's imagine there was unresolved anger was part of the issue across the nodes. Let's say a problem with sexuality. Yes, through the nature of the skip step, you're going to examine the nature of those problems. You're going to see quite clearly through the sign placement, the aspects to other planets, the nature of that issue. But what's really been going on is a flip-flopping. And therefore, in a way, both nodes have been made de facto south nodes. Because in order for there to be flip-flopping, you have to have gone somewhere before you can shoot back. So the north node must have been developed, at least in part, for a while, like a south node. Then the specific analysis of the skip step, through the archetypes, through the sign and the placements it makes to other planets, becomes the nature of the issue that caused the fumble. So we're running across a little stepping stones across a river, you know? And we leap too far and so we fall back. It shows the nature of the missing stone, if you like, the missing piece. Does that help?
And the resolution node
becomes the way that if you consciously develop that north node with the awareness of the issue through the identification of what the skip step means, say the unresolved anger of a Mars skip step, and say the Mars had been in Taurus and it was resolving through a kind of Aquarius node, or objectivity, detachment, understanding, identifying that anger first. We use all the same principles we're using with the rest to identify the nature of the skip step, and then it's through developing the resolution node with an awareness of what was left behind that we'll see that skip step come into. Is that great? Any other questions? Cool. Let's close, yeah?